Hey everybody, welcome to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. I'm here with Shashi. You may notice the lack of one of the third of our musketeer group. Damon unfortunately can't make it today, but there's a lot to talk about this week. Lots of really interesting going on in the space of tech. And I think we should just kick it right off. Apple had WWDC. Shashi, did you see it? What are your thoughts?
I saw it, and my thoughts are mixed. So I'll talk about what I liked and where I think there's still some open questions. So what I liked, the theme that Apple promoted was AI for the rest of us. I think that is a really good angle for Apple. What Apple has as its core advantage is usability. It's got people on platform. It's got lots of non-tech users that have a very friendly interface. And so it's a really great angle for Apple to take in terms of delivering AI to the end user, which to be honest, as a macro scale, AI has done a lot in investment, but it really hasn't delivered end user value yet to the general population, and AI and Apple can take that angle and deliver on that. So I thought that angle was really smart. I've heard lots of people talk about the calculator app in pro and con. I thought the pencil aspect of it was really cool. I thought that was a really interesting delivery of that application. And the stock price, the first day after the announcement, was down, but now is up considerably. They're up just in the last week, 12%. So that's got to be pretty meaningful from the point of the leaks, and then from the announcement itself. So Apple has done well for itself in terms of the AI delivery. Some of the other features are sort of blah. Of the announcement, like changing the icon colors. I mean, being able to put your icons where you want, not so impressive, but that's a quick take. Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, my favorite part, I think Apple Intelligence and that entire announcement is obviously the thing that got some level of virality to and started a larger conversation about what Apple is. I really like the calculator demo. I thought that was incredible. I really liked it. Being able to do Algebra Live, I just thought that's fantastic. And I thought the implementation was really, really clean. Fantastic, product delivery, fantastic demo. Again, assumptions about how that looks in the real world, but I think just for now, that feature is super cool. I think obviously the bigger thing to discuss is Apple Intelligence. We've been kind of talking about for a while, hey, what's Apple going to do? What is Apple going to do? And we've finally seen it. I think I have a lot of things that I kind of want to explore there. I think we've said multiple times Siri sucks, right? We've talked about this idea that Apple has this potential just sitting right in front of them. They've kept on missing on it. I think one thing that's really interesting to me is that the choice of implementation, right? In all these podcast episodes, we've been talking about NVIDIA. We've been talking about the reliance on supply chain, whatever, right? Apple's uniquely positioned that they have their own silicon and their own manufacturing supply chain. And their implementation is one where we've seen that they made a deal with OpenAI to have ChatGPT and partner with them. But the most interesting thing to me is that to call ChatGPT is you have to request permission from the user before that happens. I think that is really, really interesting. Of course, they're very private. They keep stuff on the device and they have this private cloud idea. I just really wonder what that's going to look like. Because the way I was reading the OpenAI ChatGPT deal is that ChatGPT and Siri would basically become the same product. But now it very much feels like they expect users to take a manual step beyond what the natural user flow is to then use an external service. I think that's really interesting. I don't know what to make of it yet, but it stands out to me from the way they delivered the Apple Intelligence product.
I really like that implementation of how to integrate ChatGPT. I would have been much more suspicious of an integration that didn't require a user consent. And I thought that the kind of overall theme of privacy and security of your data and being in charge of your own data, Apple promised it wouldn't train on your own data. It promised you would have private cloud, that it would compute on device. I'd love to hear your thoughts on device versus cloud. But just to address the question you raised about OpenAI, I thought this was the exact right way to if you're Apple, to implement a third-party AI provider in a way that, as I understand it, is completely anonymized from OpenAI. So OpenAI can't gather information about you, and that Apple would be anonymizing your IP so that even your IP address, they couldn't aggregate all of the questions you ask ChatGPT from your own device, OpenAI wouldn't be able to accumulate that into an idea about you because the IP is getting anonymized with each query. So I thought that was really well done in terms of that connection point.
Yeah, well, I wonder. I think the idea of running these like kind of smaller language models that can serve most needs on like chip, and then having like servers that how private these servers actually end up being, like and how protected that is. We've seen like iCloud has had its issues before. We'll see how that actually plays out. I think I'm overall pretty positive on the high level of the approach. I think I do wonder. They've said that they want to integrate other models. They'll make like hypothetically Gemini or Mistral or whatever it may be as available as kind of third-party API calls you can make. I wonder about what the user pattern will become, right? I think for a lot of like lay users, like for anyone who's like just interacting with these tools, you've used ChatGPT. It's kind of become your kind of go-to search engine for information, right? But in this kind of like implementation, they've almost introduced like a friction point in utilizing ChatGPT as the backend, right? I wonder what is actually going to play out insofar as I'm a user. I want to get knowledge really quickly. I find it hard to accept the idea that a user is going to say like, oh, Siri's answer was insufficient. What I'm going to do instead is then ask ChatGPT to take care of this query for me versus just back out and type it up myself, right? There's only like so many failures that you have like tolerance for. That I wonder what that ends up practically looking at like for the end user at the kind of the end of the day.
Do you think this is analogous to the browser selection where you have kind of a default browser? Perhaps you have a default AI engine. Users might initially start with kind of the Apple one selected, but you could, as a user, go in and say, I want my default AI engine to be ChatGPT.
Yeah, I think that's realistic. I think when we look at it practically, like ChatGPT and these AI applications, they're still so early. I think in general, folks who are using them are pretty tech forward or they're students or young. I do think that there is like for a lot of people, like beginning to use AI in some mass capability, like generative AI specifically, this might be kind of the first instance for them, right? Obviously, ChatGPT has a very large user base, but in the totality of like, here are all smartphone users in the world, it's relatively small, right? I wonder for the typical person who's just like maybe an AI skeptic or just like AI neutral person, what that choice ends up being, right? We've existed in a state where like with the browser analogy, like Google is a company that exists and had a moat and a recognizable brand for the browsing space before the iPhone was a thing, right? But what does that mean when people are going to be beginning to use like, for example, email editors or email drafters, right? And people haven't used Grammarly before. They haven't used ChatGPT severe capacity before on their phone, right? Will they opt to do that sort of thing, or will they just do whatever ends up being sort of natural, right? In that Apple provides a default function, people never look beyond what that default function is. I think it raises like an interesting question that I don't really have an answer for, but like, what does consumer AI begin to look like now that Apple's made a very big step into what they want to do with mobile? We'll see. It's interesting.
Yeah. I find maps and music to be similar in some ways. So you might start with Apple Music, and if you take the time to install the Spotify app and you set it up as your default music app, then the internal guidance may play your Spotify playlist instead of your Apple one. But it takes a little bit more work to set that up, or like Maps. If you ask for directions, it might start off just giving you the default out of the box Apple one. But if you go to the trouble of setting up Waze or Google Maps, it might be able to switch over to that instead.
Yeah, it's also this might be kind of hopping topics, but we've also kind of talked about like with startups and all this AI space, we talked about like NVIDIA being the like kind of core shovel seller of everything. And it's also really interesting to me that Apple is the one monolithic exception where they have their own chip that's not NVIDIA based. I do think that it feels, I think Apple Intelligence as a whole, there are a lot of like pretty mixed opinions on it. Some people say like this is fantastic. Other people say like this is pretty stupid. I don't really have a good sense of why people have like a pretty high con list aside from like privacy concerns or that sort of thing. But I think at the level of what this ends up playing like practically, it is interesting to poke at what is the ecosystem going to look like, since Apple already kind of plays on that to a very severe margin, at least at the level of consumer usage of AI tooling.
Yeah, just to raise the news on NVIDIA, NVIDIA did a 10-to-1 stock split on June 7th or so. And why does a company do a stock split? It's to help the smaller, more retail investors get access to the stock. If the stock price is, let's say, $10,000 a share, and you don't have $10,000, it's just harder to get equity exposure. And for the company, it opens up a broader universe of buyers. So if more people can buy your stock, then it has the potential of going up faster and being more valuable as a company. So that's what's the reasoning behind doing the stock split. And it seems to have been working. Just today, it's up 3.5%, which many stocks would be very happy to be up for the month or the year. NVIDIA is a runaway train and on the order of 3 billion market cap now. So the stock split seems to be well reasoned. The bottom of as we've said, the bottom of the tech stack seems like the most well formed and structured and reliable. And NVIDIA doesn't seem like it has any strong competitors at this point that can eat away at its market share. It's hard to imagine, at least from my point of view, that NVIDIA will erode in value in the very near term. And so what can we build on top of it? All the other applications, the data centers, the big AI apps are being built off of CUDA and NVIDIA. And the large language model now section is where it's more formed, but the startups, as you say, are constantly in this dance with the dev tools being supportive and the LLMs being eroding. So you constantly are in this dance where you have more and more dev tools available to build your own application on top of, and yet you're fighting against where large language models might take market share from you or make you obsolete. So it's a delicate dance. How do you see that dance playing?
Yeah, I was, so the day we're recording, it's the same day as Databricks Data Plus AI Summit. I was watching it just now before we started recording. Jensen Huang was on. He was talking to Oli, the CEO of Databricks. It is pretty interesting kind of hearing a lot of the takes that like Databricks promotes. Obviously, they have a lot of really large enterprises as their customers. And it seems like there's a lot of, the higher up you go in company size, the more arguments there are for like entirely skipping the LLM, actually, which was surprising to me. There's a lot of companies that like, they want to do this thing called pre-training, where they take their personal enterprise data. Obviously, you have to be a certain company size to have anything like that that's meaningful. But you take that data, you pre-train like basic models off that sort of stuff, and then those models feed into an open source LLM that becomes your proprietary LLM, right? I think with startups, like, I think consumer startups have become especially interesting, especially seeing Apple. I mean, nothing of what Apple did was surprising. It was just kind of, it was really interesting to look at how big their cleave was. Like basically like any like AI app that you would think of for like mobile, whatever, like they integrate to some capacity. And that's not to say that there wasn't value in what the startups were doing. It was kind of like a difficult attempt to begin with, if you assume Apple's probably going to do the same thing at some point. Even some of the more sillier things like the like emoji generation and all that sort of stuff, like it's low economic impact for a startup, I imagine. I can't imagine you're pulling that many users to generate emojis. But for Apple, it's a very easy thing to just squash and ship and move on. I think with the balance between LM and application, I find, even in like our own like startup, right? There's this dance we do between what do we do with data? What do we do with application? That's still kind of, it's gray more than it is like we focus entirely on application or we focus entirely on engine. That to me currently feels like you focus on application. And in doing so, like you hope to isolate one specific type of user for whom the engine is tailored. You don't innovate the LM. You don't innovate the underlying data necessarily. What you do tailor is the way that application works and what parts of the engine you build to facilitate that application. There is also an interesting topic about like hardware startups as well. I don't know if you end up opening your Humane pin ever, but
I never opened the Humane pin. I'll probably try to send it back. Okay. I've got it over here.
Are they allowing you to refund it? Wasn't there a thing where they're stopping cancellation system? Okay.
I've been out of the country. It's probably $700 of garbage at this point. But if we have time, I'll open it.
I see. Do you think, obviously as someone who invested and got one of these pre-orders early, like what was your outlook on something like Humane in the short term, and how do you react to something like that now? Like, do you think a startup like that could exist?
I never saw it as a replacement for the phone, so I wasn't going in with the expectation that this is eventually going to be a phone replacement. I saw it as innovator, early adopter on the Jeffrey Moore curve of play with the toy, and maybe it has some value, maybe it doesn't. It reminds me of Google Clips. I don't know if you ever saw those. It was like these little like clip-on camera microphone things that connected to your Pixel phone. And you could, the idea was you could clip on one of these things and it would record you playing with your child, and you could use two hands so you could hold your kid and feed them. You're not trying to kind of get the camera out, point it exactly the right direction. So it would do this sort of passive periodic recording thing. It didn't go very well. As evidenced by you never hearing of it, but it sort of reminds me of that. And so I bought it as a kind of a hobbyist. Let's play with the toy and see what happens. Not with the expectation of it really going somewhere. So I'm not super shocked or disappointed, but I'm a little disappointed.
I see. Do you think there is a space for consumer hardware? Like I guess like now, like we've seen Rabbit, we've seen Humane, those are the two hot ones.
Yeah.
What do you think, do you think there is a space for a start to say we are going to make consumer AI first hardware? And if so, what does that look like? Or if not, why?
Yeah, I think the general purpose consumer is really hard to go after as a startup. I think specialist consumer, for example, there are certain pieces of hardware for runners, like the chest strap, for example, that integrates. It's not something for everybody. It's a special subgroup of people that care about this specific measurement and want the specific hardware. Mm-hmm. But I think it's dangerous territory to go after the general purpose market like Humane mm-hmm. was. I could see lots of industry specific or specialist type pieces of hardware that could be interesting.
I see. Yeah, I think I'd agree. I think the idea of like IoT in general is one that's very enticing. I mean, obviously we've seen like Alexa and Ring very comfortably live in this space. And there's a lot of, I think that there is something interesting about the idea of like, if your smartphone already has all of like this AI, like quote unquote Apple intelligence capability built in, like what can we do with IoT devices that run their own compute but are able to like speak over Bluetooth or whatsoever? Like what can we do if Apple intelligence and our smartphones are plugged into those and have like a vocal assistant that can then interact with that stuff? But even then, that also feels pretty, at least for now, feels like it's very niche insofar as like you're relying on like very, very early adopters who want to try something very novel. I will also say the idea of AI being branded as Apple intelligence for the sake of what they're doing, I found pretty funny too. It was just clever. That nice little SEO play they made right there.
I would, if I were to go after IoT, I wouldn't go on person. I would go in environment. So I would kind of find some niche that didn't rely on the person carrying it around, because I think that market will be very, very difficult to carve a niche off in. I could envision environmental, whether those are kind of you can imagine like flying insects sort of form factor with camera, microphone. Maybe they're for the purpose of weather monitoring or traffic monitoring or home security or something like that. Like I would find a small form factor that that could have a bunch of different sensors in some environment mm-hmm. that's not kind of being walked around by the person and tasked with monitoring a certain kind of thing. For example, you might have like a PI service. Yeah. I want to chase down whatever my ex-girlfriend's doing.
We're getting real Black Mirror. Hold on.
Yeah.
Have you seen them?
No, yeah. Or if, there are a lot of PIs that probably would like some kind of, mosquito monitoring system.
Have you seen Black Mirror episodes in general or not?
Yeah.
Have you
I
seen
love
the?
Black Mirror.
I'm forgetting the name of the episode, but the one with the like robot bees. And
Yeah.
they get hacked, and that becomes like a apocalyptic event just because someone's able to like take care of all the bees that are basically just these like controllable termites. Very great, very fantastic. You had mentioned the idea of not in the call, but kind of offline. The idea of like Apple shipping software as their kind of pulls towards new products. I think this is the first time that's pretty interesting that they're kind of like locking a software feature entirely behind. Like, it makes a lot of sense that you need Apple Silicon from the latest models to run these new Apple Intelligence features. But what was like your kind of like general read on the way that Apple is pushing please buy iPhone 15 and beyond to do these new things we're releasing?
Yeah. For the last 5 to 10 years, it's felt like every iPhone release has felt like a razor blade commercial where they just add another razor blade. It's like now we have the 7 razor blade model. Yeah. It's felt like, well, okay, now we've got a fifth camera on the back. It just felt like a little bit, formulaic, and it's hard to see how some of the spec improvements that they've pitched in the past have directly resulted in end user improvements and functionality. And that's why I think that the renewal cycles have gotten longer and longer. People keep their phone very happily for 2 or 3 years and don't feel like they're missing out on anything. And it's interesting now that what the market is really looking for is a software-based improvement, not a hardware spec improvement. And yes, the hardware specs may need to improve, the silicon may need to improve, but really the end user benefit is the software, the on device, what Siri can do, what the Apple Intelligence can do on device for you. Primarily that people are looking for as the key differentiator for whether they buy another phone or not. I find that transition interesting. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think I'm very much the same. Like, until my phone basically like implodes for some reason, that like the battery gets shot. I mean, I'm currently on I'm on an iPhone 13 Pro Max that I got like maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and was paying for it over the course of 3 years. But I dropped it in a restroom in New York, and it has since kind of collapsed a little bit. It's still functional. It's just like the casing is broken. But this to me feels like, depending on like the nature of that integration, it feels to me like when I look at the iPhone, this is the first time in a while that I've been like, okay, I could probably justify this purchase to get access to the new feature. Like it feels like something that I would do a move for. Whereas there was just like, okay, like you add like a third lens, or like this claims to be like this percent like longer, or this has like some waterproof ability. It is interesting to me, like, obviously hardware, like the way it has been going is kind of very conventionally like Moore's law-y, and that like it's just like process faster, store more. And we're seeing the same thing happening with AI. Like that's the big movement we're seeing. And iPhones and general like phone tech in general has been very software forward. It just hasn't felt like, I would assume all this tech that they're proposing can very much run on like 14s, 13s, whatever. They're just kind of locking it behind to kind of keep the sales cycle going. I don't know how sustainable that is. In just like, you could probably argue like higher capabilities, like larger features. There's only, at least in the current moment, unless like someone discovers some massive improvement, there's only so much you're going to be able to say like, you can run this massive thing on like a silicon chip in here, right? At some point, I do feel like for what becomes leading edge, you are going to have to assume cloud, unless someone invents some major chip invention or something that gets like inference speeds way, way up. So I feel like it works for the short term. I don't know what it looks like longer term. That feels much more vague in the moment.
So just to make sure I understand what you're saying, do you think the features that were shown in the WWDC can run on your phone? Do you think your phone has the compute to do it?
I think some subsection of them. I think like text generation, like email drafting, the summarization, whatever, I would bet that is running on phone. I think the moment they showed like image stuff, I would incline that that's running cloud. And like, I think all the personal context stuff about like, oh, like we're going to see that you have this like meeting at this time and we're going to schedule an Uber for you. I would bet that's running all cloud side. But at the same time, like the whole justification is like you have to have an iPhone 15 to run any of these things. But I can't like believe that the iPhone 15 is capable of running all of that at a reasonable pace. You know,
Interesting.
We haven't
Sounds
seen
like a class
that
action
much.
lawsuit. We need to get a good lawyer on this class action lawsuit.
Well,
Get my iPhone 13 Pro juiced.
The only thing that's going to really work is if the EU changes a hardware spec, and that's the only thing that seems to make them move. I think we might need more than just one kid from Portland suing them.
Didn't Elon get sued by a guy with like 7 shares that like voided his $50 billion pay package or something? Do you remember Elon's pay package? He got voided by a guy with like 7 shares or something stupid.
Wow. that's great.
Yeah,
I have no idea.
Obviously for people who aren't kind of in tech, that if something is running in cloud, then it can run just as well on an iPhone 13 as it could on an iPhone 15. So there's no real need to put it behind an upgrade wall of having to move to the latest hardware. But it's obviously good for Apple if you do. So sounds like interesting fodder for some attorneys out there to play with.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, outside of the Apple Intelligence stuff, there's like enough interesting stuff that was announced that like, I would understand like, oh, we need this OS push and like this OS is only compatible with like this hardware we have applied, whatever. That's been fairly typical in that like at some point they stop releasing certain operating systems to iPhones, and I guess you just kind of accept that that's part of the pattern. I think like a lot of the stuff, they had more ecosystem level announcements, like they showed like a demo of like, you can have your phone and like have your phone like fully interactable on the context of your own screen. We've seen something like that. I assume they're using something that they use for like Xcode simulator, right? Where if you're developing an iPhone app, you can have a simulator running your application kind of like a mock instance. They just kind of did the reverse. And there's also stuff like being able to like remote control someone else's iPad, which I can imagine like if you're helping like your grandparents or something interact with technology, makes a lot of sense. And that feels like it requires like maybe like a different wire and networking chip and that sort of thing. So I can kind of see it. It's just like the bundling feels like surely not all of this is running on like the tiny little piece of silicon you have in this thing. Like no way, man. We'll see.
Is there something there for startups to take away in terms of privacy or security? How do you see as a startup builder? How do you see benefiting in the same way that Apple's trying to benefit from the desire for security?
Yeah, I think that, so, I mean, we even talked about this a little bit internally when Apple showed off this idea of like the private cloud. Obviously, like with ScholarAI, a lot of our users end up being like in institutions or like in pharmaceutical companies or legal spaces where they have to be pretty private about the sort of stuff that they ship. I think privacy all in all is going to be increasingly important. I just think that the current wave of AI adoption has been very consumer. Like we haven't seen too many instances of a tech startup or company selling a purely AI product to a non-technical enterprise. There's a lot of reasons for that. And if you're not interested in enterprise, I don't think you have to be like too stressed about privacy. I've kind of come to the conclusion that consumers, as much as we make it a pretty common point, consumers fundamentally don't care that much about privacy. Like most people are very happy just like using the applications they like, et cetera, checking the box and hitting accept and moving on with their day. When you look at enterprise, I think that's going to be increasingly important, especially insofar as like maybe not at the level of like what your core technology actually does, but just insofar as like giving companies peace of mind, because we've seen so much of these systems get things wrong. You know, like everyone is wary of, I'm an LLM. If I poke the ChatGPT like interface in a certain way, I can get it to regenerate this NOIT article I wrote 3 years ago. Depending on the nature of the organization you're trying to sell to or build a product for, I think privacy becomes important. But at a certain layer, like depending on how consumer your product is, it does feel like at some points people just don't care. It'll grow increasingly important, but it to me feels like a cherry on top of what is already kind of like a fantastic product. People love the iPhone. People already have their brand loyalty. That privacy just becomes something that they can point to when looking at other companies at the same time.
It feels like we're in the early innings of AI. Mm-hmm. And the biggest beneficiaries so far, at least in market value, have been the big tech companies. It's brand new algorithm with new hardware gets opened up, and those two things accelerate the value creation of the biggest tech companies in the world. And that's where, at least on paper, most of the market cap growth has accrued to the very big tech companies, Microsoft, now Apple, and NVIDIA has been underlying all of those gains. So NVIDIA has gained the most, but the biggest tech companies seem like they've been the beneficiaries of AI so far. But it feels like we're early innings. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, it does. I think when I look at if I look at the startup and if I look at like kind of two ends of the spectrum of like innovators in this space, what I feel like I see happening is there's a very like significant portion of like hyperactive startups that build what feel like pretty obvious things to make. Like it's just like these are good ideas and they rely on their speed to kind of get them out there. But at least as far as like consumer and platform products, it feels very vulnerable. It feels like the person best positioned to do that. And it seems like the general spirit of Silicon Valley and these big firms has kind of shifted to say like, let's get our own internal innovation teams to look at what our company does critically and try and disrupt our own processes, like try and make our own competitor to us internally, and we'll launch that. It does feel to me like, again, the advantage, I look at Databricks as like the common example here. So many startups were born in the infrastructure, like AI space, like, hey, let's optimize LLMs, like let's help you fine tune, etc. And either A, they were in a good spot and they were fast enough to prove to Databricks, like, hey, you guys are worthy of acquisition, continue doing what you're doing just under our name. Or B, too slow, got squashed, and Databricks ended up building the thing that they were pitching anyway. And whatever the startup ended up doing, whoever traction they had just kind of ended up being proof towards the idea being worth approaching. It does feel to me, and this I think gets to the larger conversation of like, what is a technical moat? I feel like it's becoming increasingly so that the technical moats is like your company's existing identity and brand and audience and velocity. It feels like it kind of comes down to those two things. A startup can survive on velocity. I think that we're just seeing this space get faster and faster. And if you're able to keep up, that in and of itself is an advantage. That at least makes like a startup like interesting for acquisition or well positioned to learn a lot. But if you look at the grander scale, I would assume that if you are a startup that's making some enterprisey or developer platform tool, assume you're going to be competing in some extent with the big players inevitably. Like that's just kind of very, very hard to avoid.
Do you think the market is now ready for lots of acquisitions of promising tech startups, whether that's dev tools or enterprise applications? Or do you think that's still like we're not there yet at the breaking point where everybody's ready to find a solution?
I think, I don't know, I'm not well read on market conditions. This is I guess between the three of us, like Damon kind of sits in the center that like he has done some like VC like due diligence stuff. He has like, some VC experience. Obviously you're very experienced. Here I am just kind of like hitting drums over and over until things work. So I'm not exactly like well educated on like how to read sentiments about like how big companies and how money is generally moving in these spaces. I would assume, I guess, just like given the economic state and the pace at which different companies are moving, it feels to me like the appetite for acquiring like 2 to 5 year old startups is pretty high, assuming they have something. I would assume like Facebook, Databricks, NVIDIA, whosoever, like if you are a builder in this space and you've been working on a product for a while that has enterprise momentum or has like decent contracts, that is appetizing enough to a big firm to acquire, if nothing else, but for the fact that you've accumulated a team that is decently well educated relative to most engineers in how to build these products fast and get them out to the world fast and productionalize them fast. As to how the money for that works, it does very much feel to me like there is like kind of like a it kind of used to be like, oh, it's like startups have the advantage of moving really fast. Big enterprises move really slow. And that's kind of the expected way that startups can catch up and compete. It does feel to me like there is a tonal shift happening at the moment where every enterprise wants to be accelerated or every tech enterprise at least wants to be accelerating very, very heavily on AI. Given that like there is so much promise there, it's just kind of like a couple of steps and like key insights away from making permanently unlockable. I don't know. What about your take? This is the monkey banging a drum. I'll defer to the expert here.
But you're one of the best drummers in the world.
Oh, thank you. I'm touched.
I think a lot of it depends on the sentiment of the builders in the moment. And what I mean by that is there are times where there's lots of VC, there's lots of energy and momentum. You're building, you're growing. It's all positive. And then there are always difficult times in startups where it feels like, it's hard to raise or you're not sure where it's going. And I'm excited about the opportunity coming up for us to acquire other promising startups, add engineers to our team that are super talented, that we can expand the scope of what we can go after. And I think that's most likely to happen at the next crunch. And then, so I guess the thinking behind my question is, when is this next crunch coming, and who are the teams, the companies out there that we would love to work closely with and bring, come together with, bring them into the entity and build together. And so I'm just kind of scanning for that and thinking about that condition and preparing for it so that when we hit that condition that we can do some acquisitions.
Yeah, I think there's like it's interesting at the general like scale of sizes. Like the ones that I have like high visibility on is all like Llama index, LangChain kind of size, maybe just a little bit below, where over the last like year or two, there were a number of very high valuation raises, like even just like seed capital raises or Series A that end up being very large and very prominent. I think there are a lot of cases of those startups where they grew a team, they have a product and they have a user base, but like getting meaningful revenue can be especially hard, just in like, especially if you're in consumer, especially if you're in like developer platforms, because you're competing with your own audience. So I think that there's a lot of talent out there. It's just being very thoughtful about how you direct it, I think, is what ends up being very critical, right? Especially when you look in like, if you look at the conversation of M&A, right now, AI and LLMs are so relatively early. I think they're reaching a certain maturity point where there is like kind of becoming like, here are the expected skills you have if you are hired as like an LLM engineer by some company. But we're not exactly there yet. It still very much feels like it's very much a level playing field between like all the engineers in the world. Like everyone kind of has the same base level of understanding about how these systems are built, what to optimize for, how to understand them. That if you point a team at the right question, you get a lot out of them. Picking the right question is really, really hard right now, which is where I think we'll see the crunch happen. It's folks who like focus on the wrong question or index on the wrong problem to a too severe capacity. And even if they have the talent, it's just the product can't simply match what is the market demand. You know, it's hard for an enterprise to justify acquiring this thing because the thing they built is probably easier done within that big enterprise on their own, right? But that being said, there will be a mismatch, I think, between here are the startups on offer and the products they've built, and I want to acquire them because of the product, versus I want to acquire them because this team has spent 2 years in the weeds of understanding like the rest of us, and they are a really fantastic group of learners more than anything. That feels like it's coming. It's just hard to say when. It feels like there will be like a separation between here are the companies that are mature enough to get acquired just because of their velocity by like the big firms, and here are the companies that just get dissipated into the wind based on poor luck, basically, on their product.
Yeah, makes sense.
Anyway, we completed our 1 year anniversary. If you want to talk a little bit about that. Yeah. We had
congrats.
It's been interesting, I guess, over the last year. At least for me, this is kind of my first rodeo with any of this sort of stuff. It's been a lot of fun. I know we have a lot of exciting things really coming up that hopefully we'll just keep shipping faster and faster. But Shashi, we maybe want to talk about merch and the kind of ideas we've been
let's
having
talk
about that sort of
merch.
stuff?
Yeah. So we've got a fun internal team hackathon happening, and one of the prizes is getting to design the 1-year merch, which employees will get for free, and that we will put out there for our customers and fans to be able to snag one. There will be a limited number. We're not going to produce a ton. And the design will be done by one of our engineers in-house. So it's truly authentic, representing us as a team and who we are. And so it'll be an exciting upcoming announcement when we have merch available for people to snag one up before they disappear. Yeah, 1 year. It's how's the 1 year ride been? You happy with this crazy adventure you signed up for?
Yeah, it very much feels like I think when we first started developing this thing, there was like the group formed kind of earlier than 1 year, right? We kind of like started chatting with one another and just kind of like kicking the can around on ideas. And I think I look at a lot of the time I've spent on this thing with like a lot of like gratitude. I just kind of like look at like moments of like what feel like luck really more than anything, and just like executing at those moments of luck that have counted for a lot. To put us in the position we are today. And so it's been a really fun year. It's been a very busy year. There's still a lot to do and still a lot to learn, but I've liked it. It's been good. I think I look at like the stuff we've done so far and I'm like constantly impressed and just surprised by like, we did do that, didn't we? I look at like this podcast and the audience it has. I'm still constantly surprised. I look at our user base and like the fact that I'm able to like just chat with users on like a daily basis about like figuring out like what they're up to and what they have problems with. It's really fantastic. I think as we keep going forward, there's still so much to learn, so much to try, but I'm really excited about the team we have. I'm really excited about the stuff we've done and the stuff we're trying to do. I'll just keep on taking one step at a time and moving forward and learning what we can. This AI space is it's very different from what I was expecting for typical startup life, in that like it feels like your product has to adapt every like couple of days more than like weeks or months. But we're figuring out it's very fast paced, and that comes with its pros and its cons, but we're learning and trying to keep up and not be crunch and rather do the crunching.
Yeah. I'm really grateful too. I'm really grateful to get to work with you, Lakshay. I'm really grateful to get to work with Damon and learn from both of you guys and all of our team. This is an incredible, more than anything, having gone through a few startup rounds, I love the journey. I love being able to ride along with people I really like and respect and learn from. You and Damon are incredible co-founders. I'm very grateful to get to be on the journey with you and to highlight some of the accomplishments of our first year. We've got now, to start with YouTube, over 100,000 subscribers on this YouTube channel. Incredible. Yeah. So if you haven't liked and subscribed, hit us up and join our numbers. So 100,000 subscribers. I never thought I'd be involved in anything that would generate such a thing. And really, the kudos from my kids on getting the YouTube play button, which I have yet to unbox, but we've got one now for crossing 100,000 subs. We'll unbox that one next episode. But we've also got over 500,000 users. We've got 500,000 users on ScholarAI. We've got almost 1 million GPT conversations. Just incredible. And over 60 scientific publications. It takes time to write a scientific paper and publish it. And to have over 60 publications mention us in final published papers is pretty incredible. So great job, very beginning of the journey, so much fun ahead, but couldn't ask more for our first year.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I will say, I think of the co-founders being, I guess, I would consider myself the least experienced, just insofar as like doing the startup thing. Damon's had to start before this that like actually made money. I just had side projects where I do appreciate, I think, having almost like coaching and being able to have you two just as kind of like presences in like my mental space has been constantly fantastic. I think that there's, it'd be interesting, I think, maybe when we have more time to talk about like even just like the startup journey and what that looks like and what it looks like to start something. It'd be interesting to kind of like share perspectives, kind of like at all three of our like kind of perspectives and levels of experience and what that's kind of like. I think it'd be interesting to kind of go more into like the builder space and talk a little bit more about like, hey, startups are fun. Here's why you should do one. Here's what it looks like, and here's what you should be ready for, and that sort of thing. It is really funny that we're doing all these compliments and nice little hugs and kisses while Damon's out, but I guess you'll have to listen to the recording.
He's getting love too.
Cool. Okay, cool. So I guess we'll wrap it there for the day. Thank you all for listening. I'll try and match Damon's tempo on this outro, but like, comment, probably subscribe. We will talk to y'all soon. Leave any questions or concerns in our email and comments.
Jump on our Discord. Yeah, we got a Discord now, so feel free to hit us up there.
That's also a good thing. We do have a Discord. We announced very recently APIs. We're working on a lot of stuff. We have stuff coming down the pipe. If you're not on the Discord, great place to chat with us. We're always there. So feel free to reach out to us if you want to just chat, have conversations, and we're happy to help. So thank you all for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Awesome.
Bye.